Welcome into the Spiritual Evolution podcast. I want to start this with a quote from Rudolf Steiner. This conception of the ego presents difficulties to many people. It has become clear to us that this ego of man has developed from a group soul nature, from a kind of all-inclusive universal ego, out of which it has been differentiated. It would be wrong if man were to crave to go down again with his ego into some sort of universal consciousness, into some sort of common consciousness. Everything which causes a man to strive to lose his ego and dissolve it into a universal consciousness is the result of weakness. He alone understands the ego who knows that after he has gained it in the course of cosmic evolution, it cannot be lost. And above all, man must strive for the strength, if he understands the mission of the world, to make this ego ever more inward, ever more divine. True anthroposophists possess nothing of the empty talk which continually emphasizes the dissolution of the ego. In a universal self, the melting into some sort of primeval gruel. True anthroposophy can only put forward as the final goal the community of free and independent egos, of egos which have become individualized. It is just this that is the mission of the earth, which is expressed in love. That the egos learn to confront one another freely. No love is perfect if it proceeds from coercion, from people being chained together. Only when each ego is so free and independent that it need not love is its love an entirely free gift. It is the divine plan to make this ego so independent that as an individual being in all freedom, it can offer love even to God. Part of the issue we face today is that we suffer. We suffer in life. And it's becoming greater and greater suffering that we're experiencing because materialism has taken over and people are lost. They don't understand the concept of the spirit and soul or the etheric body or the physical body. So by not understanding that there is something infinitely greater that is part of us, which is the ego, the I am, our own, that we have made our own, that we are continuously making more and more our own divinity, there tends to be just many different paths that people end up falling down. And there's a tendency now that I see online, which is a tendency to fall into this universal consciousness, which Steiner talks about. And it makes sense because we face utter destruction of the economy, of our social life, of our cultural life, of our political life. It's basically being destroyed in front of our eyes. And because of this, we feel weak. We also have terrible foods. We have electromagnetic frequencies that are hitting us at all times. And we're basically in an environment that is not conducive for spiritual awakening. But you could also argue that it is more conducive because it's actually forcing us to confront something greater than just the physical, because the physical is breaking down around us throughout the earth, as well as within ourselves as we get older. And so as we get older, we can come towards the spirit because the spirit comes towards us. So anyway, what we've been seeing, or what I've been seeing on YouTube, is basically people who are continuously going towards this universal consciousness. And I tried to make a video on it, and it got taken down because I violated copyright laws, which I guess I didn't realize I was doing when I recorded someone else's video and then published it. So that makes sense. So I wanted to get out a similar message. It's not going to be exactly the same. So some of you may have heard this one already, but I'm trying to put it out there because I think it's important for the future. When people are when they go down a spiritual path, they need to go down a logical, scientific, spiritual path, in my opinion. And I do think that Rudolf Steiner was the greatest initiate in the history of the world that has incarnated. And, there's many reasons why this is the case, but I won't go into that necessarily now. And that's something for you to do your own research on. But he's probably the most accomplished initiate in terms of spiritual, content that he has put out there. And it's even with 6,000 lectures and 300, books or so, it's all consistent across the whole thing. There's not really an inconsistency that comes up. And every time he's coming at it from a different angle. He's literally using 12 different angles to come at basically the same things every different way that he can. So you have to respect the fact that he's done that. And in my opinion, it is the best approach to spiritual awakening because it takes a logical path. And logical thinking is the first step to spiritual development. So if you're going down a spiritual awakening, you should actually start with Plato, any philosophy, Aristotle. You could start with someone like Thomas Aquinas. You could start with Hegel, phenomenology of spirit. You could start with geometry, actually. So those are some of the things that are logical, and spiritual science basically is logical throughout the whole thing. And so Philosophy of Freedom is a very good book to try to understand because it gives you a perspective of the spirit from the spirit. It's a logic is spirit because it comes from the spiritual world and is given to us, through things like geometry, math, things like that. There's logic behind it. And so if we can think logically, we can then step forward into spiritual initiation or practices, meditation, reading spiritual scientific truths, things like that. But I think people are just basically they go on a spiritual awakening and they're thrown into this mess that is on YouTube, which I would call a Luciferic mess. Lucifer wants to pull us into this spiritual realm where there is no concept of evolution of a Christian sense. And, he wants to pull us into a more of a self-love, just doing it for myself, right? Thinking of our spirit as, the spirit within, the power within, which it's fine. But you have to balance it with doing the spiritual work. You should actually be doing it for other people at the end of the day. Your suffering through a spiritual awakening is going to help the world in the future, help other people in the future. And, if you go down a false path, which there are a ton out there, and there's a lot of people speaking on these things that have no idea what they're talking about. They just sort of get caught in this, what I would call Luciferic trap of thinking that we are all one, that, there is nothing to do, so do nothing, all of that type of thing. You and me are the same person, like the same consciousness, um, you know, that type of that type of thinking. And I appreciate it. I think there is some truth in it, like there is in everything. And I listen to Ram Dass and people like that. Um, but Ram Dass, the thing he gets wrong, and the thing that a lot of these people get wrong, is that they think the Buddha and the Christ or Jesus were the same thing. And they think that everyone has, like that everyone is sort of the same as Jesus, basically. They're not really acknowledging that the cosmic Christ itself incarnated into Jesus at the baptism in Jordan for 3 years and then died on the cross. And the cosmic Christ that is, eons above us in terms of its evolution. And that's really where we're aiming to get to, but it will be, millions of years into the future, basically. Um, and so I want to contrast the Buddha with the Christ, and I want to read a passage from Steiner. So the Buddha's monumental doctrine of suffering, which he summarized in the words, birth is suffering, old age is suffering, illness is suffering, death is suffering. All existence is filled with suffering. That we cannot always be united with what we love. This is how the Buddha himself later developed his teaching, is suffering. That we have to be united with what we do not love is suffering. That we cannot attain in every sphere of life what we want and desire is suffering. Thus, there is suffering wherever we look. And so, release from the suffering of existence is what the Buddha stresses more than anything else. And so, the Buddha who came before Christ, he laid out a path for Christ. But Christ brought in the overcoming of that suffering. So the Buddha, like the Christ, hadn't incarnated yet on the earth and hadn't connected himself to humanity for the rest of our existence through these eons and millions of years. That the Christ will be with us. And, that's profound. But the Buddha, in some ways, was the original Christian because he discovered love. And he discovered it through his path. And I think there's so much value to be had in Buddhism. I just want to be clear about that. And I love it. I read Buddhist text, and it really can help on a spiritual path for sure. It's part of a spiritual path, and it's a requirement really to get into Buddhism. But people leave out the Christian aspect of things, and the Christian aspect brings in the ability to overcome the suffering. So he, like, for example, so he said, like, for example, in the Gospel of Matthew, he said, "Blessed are they who suffer, for although the outer world is a cause of suffering because of our relationship to it, the time has now come when human beings, if they will take hold of their ego consciousness and develop the forces dwelling in their ego, will discover the remedy for suffering. Within themselves, they will find the possibility of consolation. For the time has come when any external consolation loses significance because the ego is to have the strength to find it within itself, the remedy for suffering. Blessed are they who can no longer find in the outer world all that was once found there. That is also the most important meaning of the beatitude. Blessed are they who thirst after justice, for they shall be satisfied. In the ego itself will be found a source that will supply just compensation for the injustice in the world. The coming of the Christ points to the human ego, the divine part of the human being. We should take into ourselves the living example of the Christ, for then we shall find the strength to carry over from one incarnation to another the fruits of our lives on earth. It is important for our life in the spiritual world that we should master what can be experienced in earthly existence. And so rather than the Buddhist perspective of this is everything is suffering, so just sort of focus on like, you know, your breathing or your things like that. You know, the Christ says, hey, take on the suffering, go towards the suffering, and imbue the suffering with love that is in your ego consciousness, in your heart, that you can develop for the outer world so that you can actually help transform the outer world so that the outer world is pure love, pure Christ consciousness in the future. And, you know, I'm bringing this up because, again, I see a lot of this stuff on YouTube where there is, you know, just regular people who are making YouTube videos and, you know, they're sort of making these videos and in my opinion, not really having any background of anything. I'm making these, every video I make or talk about is based on spiritual science. It is grounded in spiritual science and anthroposophy. So I just try to relate it to the world today and try to bring you different things from spiritual science that maybe can relate to what's happening in the world or can help you in your specific situation, that can help you to live a better life and to be motivated to improve yourself. And I think that sometimes, you know, I think in the short term, some of these concepts for some of these YouTubers can work for people. But in the long term, you're going to realize you're sort of back to square one at some point, and that you haven't really developed, that you sort of fell into a sort of, I don't know if you want to call it like a pleasure, like a self pleasure of like, oh, there's nothing, like I don't really have to do anything, you know, and you just kind of relax into that. And that can be good, right? I mean, we all need that sometimes, to de-stress for sure. And that's why I said there's obviously great things to be taken from Buddha, from Krishna, you know, the Vedas, Bhagavad Gita, all of that Eastern stuff. But it also needs to be balanced. And I think that's what anthroposophy does. It really balances the two, bringing in reincarnation and karma into Christianity, really for the first time, in a full sense of the historical context, of how that works. And I guess I'll also quote another piece here that I also quoted last time. We can find our soul again and join it to the spirit. If we transcend the feeling of powerlessness, we can experience both the nothingness of existence on the one hand and its glorification out of ourselves on the other. We feel in our powerlessness that the disease and the healer, the healing power, we do so if we have felt our powerlessness, which has become related to death in our souls. When we feel the healer, we feel that we bear something in our souls that can rise from death at any time in our own inner experience. If we seek these two experiences, we find the Christ in our own souls. This is an experience that humanity is approaching. Angelus Silesius stated it when he wrote, "The cross of Golgotha cannot redeem you from evil so long as it remains unraised within you." The cross may be raised within us when we feel the two poles, powerlessness through our body and resurrection through our spirit.